Tonight is the last of the series of 5, obviously. You are the gallant ones over here. I want to start by thanking our sponsors. As you see, this is from Chava Hertzberg on behalf of the Hertzberg family tonight, in the memory of her parents, Rabbi and Mrs. Hertzberg, who were in the First World War. Her father was a soldier in the First World War, so aren't too many rabbis who can say, my predecessor fought in the First World War, That's number one. And Rebbetzin Hertzberg also, I remember Menashe Shamroth said, I guess, see, we're talking about all those millions of refugees going back and forth. What was it like for the people who tried to cope with the refugee flow? And her mother and family were among those that, tried to do a little bit over there. And you have no idea what I'm talking about, because we're all Americans, and thank God we can't imagine all this. I'm talking about her mother, when she was a little girl, she said to her father, how can you take all the lice? As people come in, he said, just wash it in kerosene, that's all, and put the sheet back on the bed. You see, it's a different era. The bit said, difficult times call for difficult tzaddikim, as they say over here. Not in America, you write a check and everything's nice and antiseptic. And it's also, as you see, by the Grilly family, in memory of the righteous Christians who helped Richard's mom in the war. It was recently in the Jewish Times. Perhaps you saw it. But he wouldn't be here today if not for a fair number of do-gooders who helped his mom. There are 6 million people who didn't have that. Right? So every person who survived the war had to have somebody somewhere helping them. Because if you had nobody nowhere helping you, nicht gut. You understand? So we pay tribute to them as well. And without any further ado, thanking the shul, of course, once again for being very nice about this. And Rabbi Marwick, I want to say, I see he's in Israel already. But without any further ado, just for the record, these are the spring lectures of 2019. The name of the series is A Catastrophe But Not a Holocaust, which I think by now you'll see is a fairly accurate description. The ordeal of Orthodox Jews in the First World War. I'm not only dealing with Orthodox Jews, but I have to give some focus to it. And tonight is the last episode entitled Will It Never End? The disastrous post-war years of 1919 to 1923. So here we go. If you've been following what's going on until now, then you will perhaps remember that by the spring and summer of 1918, the entire area of the Pale Settlement, the old kingdom of Poland, was under the control of the Germans and the Austrians. They had conquered and defeated Russia. Russia surrendered in March of 1918. Russia surrendered to Germany. It's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And what the Germans said is, we want all these territories that basically used to be the old kingdom of Poland that you, Russia, took away once upon a time. We want it as a buffer. And so look at all this thing. Here's a Ganze Ukraine. Here's, Lithuania, and Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, Poland, of course, the territories beyond Poland. You get the general idea. So Russia had to give up a whole lot, but Lenin was on the ropes. And quite brilliantly, he said, let's give him whatever we need to now, and tomorrow get Tzechanetza. And he was right about that. The question then for the Germans and the Austrians, mainly the Germans, you see the Austrians really like junior partners in all this, was once again, as I said the other day, how to dispose of these territories. We're back to Koheles and Machiavelli. Now that you own all this land, what do you do with it? What's the best way for Germany to use it? The Germans didn't want to kill everybody in the First World and colonize the place. The Kaiser was not Hitler. Say it again. The Kaiser was a Christian. He was a somewhat anti-Semitic Christian, somewhat. But if you're a Christian, you believe Jesus was Jewish. You see where I'm going? So there is a difference, and there's an important difference. I want to be clear about that. So what do you do? In practical terms, the Germans came up with a plan, which they call Mitteleuropa, or the Middle Europe, to create a set of buffer states which would A, satisfy the local ethnicities with real political states, and B, create a huge buffer to keep the Russians away, and C, the states would be organically friendly to Germany in order to be protected from the Ruskies. And it makes sense. There's nothing dumb about what I just said at all, so it's quite smart. Okay? So what that means is, here's Germany, for example, and Austria. Here's Russia, mean, evil Russia, which they are. So what you want to do is, may God bless and keep the Tsar. So here you go. If you put here, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, a new Poland, a new Belarus, a new this, and look how big plans they had. The Ukraine will be this, plus the Ukraine will stick on the other side of the Crimea, and they even had plans for a German-controlled or whatever, Georgia, and by the time it's all over, Russia will have cordon sanitaire, as the French call it. The Russians will be kept away, and everybody will be happy. Everybody will be happy. They won't be able to threaten us as they did now. The Russian horde that just came in and killed and pillaged and raped everybody won't be able to do it again. And worst case scenario, they'll do it to the buffer states. They'll never get to Germany. Like I said before, it's not a dumb idea. Right? It's not a dumb idea. And the truth is, it kind of made sense because notice what I said. It does create little countries that satisfy the local ethnicities. You're Ukrainian, now you have a country called Ukraine. You're Lithuania, now you have a country called Lithuania, and so on and so forth, right? So that part is good from your angle, and that did become, in 2019, the current map. U.S. did this, right? What do we have today? Here's Russia, evil Russia. Here's Germany and Western Europe. And in the middle, now we have Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, which are independent countries. You have Belarus, which is an independent country. You have Ukraine, which is an independent country, and a little Moldova here. And the Russians are back there. In other words, the Middle Europa plan of the German General Staff came to fruition in the 1990s. Under different circumstances and different auspices, and it was George Bush Sr. and Clinton and all that. I mean, I understand the difference, but nevertheless, it shows you the essential soundness of the concept. That's my point. The German map was a little different, and interestingly so. The key point was, and here's the shtick, all these countries the German hoped would be kingdoms with German kings, Germanic kings. So, yeah, there'll be a Poland, but it'll be under some, Habsburg or somebody like that. The Ukraine will also have some Germanic prince king. So there will be a Grand Duke of Lithuania and a Grand Duke of Estonia and even a Grand Duke of Finland and so on and so forth. Listen, this is the history of Europe. In the 18th and 19th centuries, whenever a new country popped up, they got a German king. That was the fashion. Have you heard of Greece? Have you heard of Romania? Have you heard of Bulgaria? Have you heard of Belgium? And so forth. When new countries popped up, they always said, we want a royal, somebody from blue blood, with a nice dose of blue blood. And where you get those is, you have these German princes, because Germany had 100 states, 200 states, the von Pfefferkorns, something like that. And, they've had a castle since Julius Caesar, you see, and therefore you get one of those guys as a king, and so on and so forth. One of the countries that did that, you've heard of this country. One of these countries that took a German prince when they didn't have anyone is England. Right? Queen Elizabeth family is the House of Brunswick. During World War I, when there was a lot of anti-German feeling, they called it the House of Windsor. But it's the Braunschweig. It's the Royal House of Hanover. You get it? Why? Because the Stuarts ran out. They had no kids. Remember that? The legitimate Stuarts, anyway. And, forget Bonnie Prince Charlie. And so where are we going to go? Well, we got to get a German prince, So King George I couldn't speak English. This is you do it. Okay. Now, this is where the Germans are looking to, and it makes sense during the 5 minutes that this lasted, which is, the year 1918 until November. Hindenburg, who was the head of the army, he was very realistic. They said to him, let's go back one. Let's go back one. What do you need all this for? Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And so now we go to the next one. He said, I need it to secure my left flank in the next war. What does that mean? It's very realistic. If you're a European, especially the old school, wars come every 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They just do. Raise your hand if you disagree with Plato, who said, only the dead have seen the last of war. Now, I wish he was wrong. And when I was a little boy, we used to collect money for the UNICEF and all this, remember? And Mrs. Roosevelt, and there was a hope that it would be the last war. How many wars have been since Second World War? 100? 200? How many wars are going on now? A dozen? 2 dozen? You see what I'm saying? So in other words, Hindenburg simply saying, listen, Germany, Russia, sooner or later it's going to happen. I want borders now that'll get me ready for the next war. It's an interesting way of dealing with it. By the way, Israel makes this argument. Israel makes this argument. We have to hold on to this part of the West Bank and that sort of thing in case of a conflict. Right? What's the argument of Israel for holding on to the Golan Heights? what I'm saying? So don't make fun of Hindenburg. That's all I'm saying. Now, would the Germans have managed this Middle Europa correctly? That's an interesting question. That's the kind of thing we throw out in graduate seminars, right? Anyway, for Jewish purposes, there was now a new Ukraine and a new Ukrainian government, which, like Kerensky, wanted to be a normal democratic state, preceded by elections for a constituent assembly. And so the summer of 1918 saw the same political activity in a beehive fashion as the previous summer had seen in Russia. In other words, I tried to show yesterday, between the two revolutions, between the March Revolution of Kerensky and the October Revolution of Lenin, there was 5 minutes of hope. And they honestly tried to make a democracy out of it. It didn't happen. So the same thing happened in 1918 under different circumstances. Not in Russia. Russia is already controlled by Lenin. It's a civil war. But Ukraine, because it's under the German army, so nobody can touch them. And the Germans set up a Ukrainian state. You see? This was the stupidity, Baruch Hashem, of Hitler. If he would back a Ukrainian state, the Ukrainians would fight like crazy for him. He would have no guerrilla, operations in his rear and all that kind of stuff, because that's all the Ukrainians wanted. You see what I'm saying? This is well known. So anyway, here we are. We're going to have a national assembly. All parties can run for office. All kind of Jewish parties are going to run, like we did the other day. You have your Zionist parties, your Bundes parties, or this party, your Poland party, or this thing, that thing. You have the front parties. You have the Lubavitch is one thing, and this is another thing, and this is another thing. And just as I said the other day, the exact same thing happened. All the religious factions said if we splinter our vote, we'll get nothing. We have to somehow or other come together. And so it's a repeat performance of what I told you last Thursday night, when the Chavetz Chaim and all these other people come to Moscow in the middle of 1917 to try to create an Achdus party. The same thing happened, slightly differently, in Ukraine in the middle of 1918 under the auspices of the German-sponsored Ukrainian state, and you have Chaim Grudzinski and the Panvisarov and all these sorts of things of that time coming together. Because listen, why the Jews? The yeshivas, if you follow what I've been saying until now, even though it's an in and out story, by 1918 the yeshivas are all in the Ukraine. They ran away to Belarus. And then when the bombing in the front got to Belarus, they went away to Ukraine. One of the reasons is to be away from the front line. One of the reasons is also because the Ukraine, during the First World War, during 1914, 15, 16, 17, was untouched by the war. And so if you lived in Ukraine, there was food, there was normal, there was fuel. You understand? And so it was like a little paradise for the 5 minutes that it lasted. So now you're in 1918. The yeshivas were in Kremenchuk and Poltava and places like that. The Lubavitcher Rebbe at that time was located in Rostov, which is all the way near the Caspian Sea. You know what I mean? In other words, what they call the Sea of Azov, off the Black Sea, but it's far away. And he died there. So it's hard to think of Lubavitch was here in Belarus, now locating to Rostov over there. No, it's not. It's called the First World War. You see? And I'll say it again, he died in Rostov. It's kind of known. And the big figures at this was the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rabbi Grobard, who later was the chief rabbi in Toronto. Nobody's old enough to remember that, but how would you? But he was a Gaon Adir. I always call him Mr. Hot Water on Shabbos because he's the one who said you can use the hot water on Shabbos. Saying, right? Okay. Yeah. Now, he was a very, very big Polish posek and all that. And he was very active in these political affairs and helping the refugees and those kind of stuff. Him and Chaim Moshe, these kind of people, they spent a very active 1914, 15, 16, 17, 18 because of the crazy world that was raging all around them. Starvation, shivas are falling apart, families are falling apart, the prostitution issue, the political side, the pogroms, it was a nutty time to live there. Now, okay. Everything I just talked about disintegrated on November 11th, 1918, a few months later, because Germany surrendered in the West. As we know, Germany did not lose the war in the East, but did lose the war in the West. And when they lost the war, they had to completely surrender. They were cheated. Woodrow Wilson said, we'll just make an armistice and you'll have a fair peace. But once they made the armistice, then they twisted their arm and said, well, now we're going to make it as if you surrendered. You see? And we're giving you a Carthaginian peace. And the Germans say you're being too cruel, and the Allies said, well, you just did it to Russia, took all that land. You see? So, don't call the kettle black or whatever the expression is. Anyway, whatever the reason, Germany, because of the losses on the Western Front, was about to collapse. And collapse means that the Hamonam, the public, started to go crazy, especially the workers. There was starvation by this time in Germany, and malnutrition, everything goes along with that. And it's a middle-class country, they can't stand that. And you started to be riots, and most importantly, the discipline of the army started to disintegrate. And they had nightmares, there's going to be communist Russia over there. And Lenin was sending pamphlets and things like this, to stir up revolution in Germany. And so they said like this, we better, just cut our losses. And the heads of the German army told the Kaiser, you have to quit, right? You have to quit because the Allies will be harsher if you're still there. And we have to make the best deal we possibly can. They hoped for a better deal than they got. And it was weird because the German army had not retreated into Germany. They were still holding the lines in France. But if you understand what I'm talking about, the Germans were hollowed out. They had the externals, but the internals was collapsing. But the public couldn't necessarily understand that, which is why later on the general said, we didn't lose the war, the Jews did it. It's called a stab in the back. And that's what that means. Because when the war ended, we just walked back from France to Germany. So you see, we were victorious over there, which wasn't really the case. They had been hollowed out. But on the other hand, they can say, look, we conquered the whole East. So it was a very curious type of reality. The victorious allies, the Americans, the British, the French, and so forth, made a big muck of the peace. We all know that. Basically, without spending a lot of time on it, the French repeated the mistake of Bismarck. They took too much out of Germany and left them embittered. And this is Clemenceau, who thought like Hindenburg, let's crush Germany as much as we can. And when the next war comes, we'll do it again. We'll do the best we can. Will the next war be in 20 years? Could be. That's the attitude over there. Now, Woodrow Wilson said, well, let's make a peace for all time. And the French and the British ran rings around it. Woodrow Wilson was actually very stupid at Paris and Versailles. This is W. But once upon a time, you're not allowed to say that because Wilson was a saint, you understand? Now, it's not viewed that way, but it was once upon a time. And Lloyd George was a very smart fellow, and he knew this is not a good idea because you're just preparing for World War II, which of course happened. But they let the French do it. And what I mean by that is they didn't wipe out Germany. That's one way. They left them big enough to be angry and look for revenge. And they took enough land and stuff like this away from Germany to make the Germans, seething, especially in the East. In the West, the French took back Alsace-Lorraine. That you could hear. That was up for grabs. That the Germans could understand. But then they took away the Saar, and they take Danzig, and they took half of Silesia, and gave this to Poland, and this to this, and this to that, and a tiny piece to Belgium, and that was good for Hitler when he rose. You understand? So all I'm trying to say is, a wise statesmanship we see from history doesn't do that. A wise statesmanship leaves the loser pretty intact and tries to invest the loser in the status quo. Get it? Truman. That's what he did. What did we do to Japan? Nothing. You understand? We took those Mariana Islands away. Nothing. Okay, we even gave back Okinawa later. And we gave them $1 zillion in aid. So you treat them well, therefore Japan's an ally. What did we do to Germany? Same thing. Same thing. The French after World War II want to take the Rhineland, which I totally understand. And Truman said no. Now, Stalin took half of Germany in the East. So what does that mean? The Germans hated Russia and liked America. Statesmanship. So it's interesting, you understand? Now, in this case, it was particularly short-sighted because, it really was dumb, because you then now had two big, angry countries in Europe, and you don't want them to combine, and of course they're going to combine, and that's the two losers of Germany and Russia. And so 2 or 3 years after the First World War, the Germans and the Russians made a secret treaty at Rapallo. This is the Jewish foreign minister of Germany right now, who was assassinated shortly after this. Jewish foreign minister, and this is Chicherin, the Russian foreign minister, and they, Rapallo, the resort, and they made a secret deal. Russia will help Germany in the military, and Germany will help Russia in the military, and all this kind of stuff. And this is how Hitler and the German army were able to build up in the 20s secretly. You understand? Of course, then they used it on Russia, but meanwhile, the Russians learned a lot of tricks from the Germans too, didn't they? And so life is very strange. But that's not wise policy if you're the Allies, France and England. Focused on punishing Germany, the Allies gave more thought to a new Poland as a counterweight to Germany than to the other territories of Eastern Europe. That's the reason I spent the last 10 minutes on this subject. How does it affect Eastern Europe? Now, that's what we're interested in this series over here, because that's where all the Jews live, the great masses. And the truth is, Woodrow Wilson, I'm sure, didn't even know where Lithuania is anymore. Anybody here probably does. You understand? And once upon a time, he'd tell an American, Latvia, something like that. By the way, do you ever see they take these surveys every once in a while of high school students, college students? Where's Iraq? I don't know. Right? With geography, it's not necessarily the strong point. And this is the old Europe where you have all these little Medinas and everything like that. But you're the Prime Minister of France, of England, President of the United States. Your job now is to reorganize the map. You see? And so all they heard of was Poland. Everybody heard of Poland. And everybody knew that Poland had been done ill when they partitioned Poland and destroyed their nation. And Woodrow Wilson had said one of the 14 points was they'll bring back Poland. But if you ask Woodrow Wilson, how many non-Poles live in Poland? I didn't know non-Poles live in Poland. You get it? He wasn't an expert. He actually collected a whole bunch of college professors called Inquiry, brought them with him to to tell me, was Tutsuch, And so the result, no. They really were clueless, right? Mamish clueless on Eastern Europe. So they're not going to fix the situation. So wait a minute. The Germans pull out. The Allies are not intervening. What happens? A chaos. That's my point. Nobody's in charge. If nobody's in charge, like these third world countries today in Asia, Africa, whatever, it's like Hobbes, right? It's like Hobbes. What's the result? Go to the next one. Condition of man is a war of everyone against everyone. That exactly defines Eastern Europe in the years I'm talking about. Now, that's interesting for the historian. It's not good for an unarmed, hated minority like the Jews who live there in the millions. Okay. As I said, the Pirkei Avos tells us, having mispal shalom shel malchus, shalom ro ish yisrei chaim blo. A bad government is better than no government, right? Bad government better than no government. And this is what you had over here. So here we go. The Germans pull out of Middle Europa because they lost the war and they were compelled by the Allies to bring all their armies away. So now the Germans are no longer in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Lithuania, and other places, holding the fort and keeping the peace and keeping the law and order. So who does? Who does? Okay? Now, in each place, when the Germans pull out, the locals try to set up a country. Except that if you have one of these territories where there are 5 locals, like Eastern Galicia, you got the Ukrainians, you got the Poles, you got the Jews, you got some Germans living there. What do you mean the locals set up the country? If it's Poland, central Poland, it's all Poles. Warsaw and those places, Lublin, it's all Polakian, right? So in that case, the Jews don't count. So it's all Poles. So you can set up a Polish state, and that's what happened. On November 11th, 1918, when the Germans pull out, the Poles immediately in Warsaw set up a Polish government, a Polish state. Because why not? And they all agree because they're all Polish. The central core is easy. But what about the periphery? The old kingdom of Poland was very large and had a lot more than Polish people in there. What about the territories outside the core with non-Poles? Right? Take a look at this. Here's the new Poland that's going to emerge in the 1920s and 30s. This is the Poland where your relatives lived before the Second World War. The Republic of Poland. This area that I'm doing over here is central Poland. It's all Poles. But what's this? This is Lithuanians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, all the way down, Ruthenians, Germans. See my point? Okay? Now, how do you get them to agree that they should be part of New Poland? You don't. So the answer is Poles will have to conquer them. So that was what the whole First World War was about. So we end up with the classic scenario. I'm being beaten up. I want my independence. Oh, once I get my independence, then I get the right to beat up everybody else. That's the world, right? That's the world. You don't find too many tzaddikim. And so the result is, well, let's put it this way. The Poles themselves were divided. Should they reconstitute the old kingdom of Poland or not? The argument for not goes like this. What do you want all those extra Jews and Germans and all this other junk for? Just keep it ethnically pure as much as possible, just the homeland. This was the big machlokas of the two Polish leaders. Let's go to the next one. Pilsudski versus Dmowski. Pilsudski was Mr. Yes. He said, let's go and reconquer the old Poland and make up with the local minorities. Don't mistreat them and all that. And this guy said, no, we don't want all that junk. We don't want the Jews. We don't want the Germans. We want the Belarusians. The heck with the Lithuanians and all that kind of stuff, right? Which, by the way, is the situation today. In 1945, Stalin did like him, and he kicked out all the non-Poles in Poland. He also took all the Poles who were living elsewhere and stuck them in Poland. And then he said, all right, now you have, you know what I mean? Now you're all totally 100% pure Polish, and don't fight, bring me a cup. But that's not what happened in 1918, 1919. And so the problem, of course, is 1918 isn't 1618. And so the local peoples, the subject peoples and the local subject, they don't want to be part of any part of Poland. And so I introduce you to a whole bunch of wars that if your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents had the misfortune of living in Poland after the First World War, I've already finished talking about the misfortunes of living during the First World War. I'm talking about the misfortune of living after the First World War, right? If they have the misfortune of living over there, then they are involved in one set. There are like 3 or 4 or 5 sets of wars that rage in Eastern Europe in the years 1919, 1923. Isn't that something? 4 or 5 sets. One of them is, I would call the Polish set. The Poles versus the Germans, so they have a fight to take over this part of here, Posen, as you can kind of see. Here, this part, I'm sorry, right? The Poles take this from Germany, simply because once upon a time it was Poland, so you took it away from us, which is true, but by now it's Germanized. The Poles also take away this, meaning they split Germany here and they take Danzig. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Look at this. Germany, and something in the middle, called the Polish corridor. There are those who would like to do this with Medinat Yisrael currently and say, let there be a Palestinian state with a corridor connecting the West Bank with the Gaza Strip, which means you will recreate the Polish corridor. Only a blockhead, Benoshel blockhead, could propose a thing like this. Because look at the terrible, let me say this. This specific issue is what led to World War II. 1939, Hitler went to war with Poland over the Danzig issue. Okay? This specific issue. How anybody could imagine that, but they said, listen, you don't want to have a Poland with no access to the sea, and so that's how they did it. So all I'm trying to say is you do that only by fighting. I'm not finished. They have a war with Lithuania. That's over here. Let's see, this whole part that I'm pointing to here. Let's go back to the previous map for a second. One more, yeah. This area that I'm pointing to right here is not Polish at all, unless you disagree with me and you're a Polish patriot. This whole area is Lithuanian. No, I'll explain. This whole area is Lithuanian. Vilna is the ancient Lithuanian capital. No. Vilna was a city with a whole bunch of Poles for hundreds of years. That's also true. Welcome to Eastern Europe. That's why Woodrow Wilson says, I don't know what to do. You understand? Pilsudski himself is born in Vilna. And when he died, he said, bury me here, but cut my heart out and put it in a church in Vilna where it still is today. Okay? And, it's a Catholic thing. So, no, really, it is. Wait a minute. This whole area, it's not a small area, it's not gigantic, not small, means that Lithuania, which is a small country, is more or less going to be cut in half or something like that. Oh boy, the Lithuanians never got over that. Okay? And it interposes between Lithuania and the USSR and Russia. Do you see what I'm saying? It's artificial. But Poland grabbed it in 1920, and the Lithuanians were not strong enough to beat them. Who else are we fighting over here? Let's go back to the next map. Yeah. Now, Ukraine. That's this whole area over here. I'll talk about in a minute. Eastern Galicia. That's Lvov, Lemberg, Rabbi Herzberg from there, Belz, Square, these kind of places. No, it's heavy Jewish area. Also heavy Polish area. Actually heavy Ukrainian area. So what is it? Hello, Woodrow Wilson. You see what I'm saying? No, when people, no, because he said like this, we want all nationalities to be satisfied. Sounds good in theory, but what do you do when you enter Europe and they're all commingled? They're all commingled. And so how do you do it? You see? As I say before, Israel faces some of these problems, does it not? So they do grab the Republic of Poland. Pilsudski grabs this, that, and the other. But what happens? Poland is hated by everybody around them. They also took some land from Czechoslovakia down here. I don't have to give you all the detailed Teschen, And so everybody hates Poland. Oh, not too smart if you're a country situated between Russia and Germany. Ain't too smart. Maybe it's a good idea to have a couple of friends out there, right? No. You're surrounded by enemies. Do you see my point? But this is Europe, especially the old Europe. You just grab what you can. You just grab what you can. You have 5 minutes in the candy store. just take what you can, right? So that means if you're living in Lithuania, you could be shot by the Poles or by the Lithuanians in one of these wars. If you're Jewish especially, the Poles might do a pogrom on you. The Lithuanians didn't do so many pogroms, but it said the town might be burned down. Wait a minute, World War I is over. No, it's not. That's my point tonight. I mean, technically the World War was over, but all these things went on. And by the way, who's left in the Baltic states, for example, to fight the Germans? You got your Lithuanians, you got German roving bands running around, what they call the Free Corps. These are guys left over that they didn't retreat, and now they just have fun doing right-wing killing squads, as we would call them today. And one of the groups that get killed are the Jews, not the only ones, but it's the wrong time to live in Panovich. It's the wrong time to live in, in Shavel, and so on and such, and Riga. It is the wrong time to be there. And people don't know it. So every Jews are located in these areas, in Posen and Vilna and Lvov, they'll be caught in the middle, literally, with the crossfire. A lot of times, the Ukrainians will be shooting here, and the Jewish neighbors in the middle. And figuratively, here we have the trouble of the Jew in Europe. There are two ethnicities fighting in your region. Who do you side with? Now, you'd like to have the luxury of saying I side with neither. But if that means both sides will kill you, so if you're Jewish living in Belfast, you get my point? Are you a Protestant Jew or are you a Catholic Jew, as they say over there? It ain't funny, okay? And lots of Jews get killed either by choosing the wrong side, being perceived as choosing the wrong side, and even if they choose the right side, eventually the other side comes back in. Jews historically, as a tiny helpless minority, always did the only logical thing, which is to always side with the strongest person around, because what else are you supposed to do? So whenever a country came in, the Jews historically never gave them any trouble. If you're the new power, then fine, we serve you. If you're the new power, then we serve you. Okay? It's in the Bible, actually. But what happens when these powers are perceived as tyrannical, and then the minorities or the downtrodden majorities attain power? Oh, we remember what you did when you sided with our oppressors. So how do you get it right living in Lemberg and Lvov? How do you get it right? You see? And indeed, there emerges an entire set of wars between Poland and its neighbors. This is only one set of the wars that takes place in Europe during the 4 years after the First World War. And sometimes the Poles are successful, like in this war between what they call, nobody even knows this stuff exists. It's called the Polish-Ruthenian War of 1918 to 1920. Who even heard of it? Over there they heard of it. They know it in the schools. You in America don't have to do it, right? So here's a very famous scene where the Polish kids defended the cemetery in Lvov against the attacking Ukrainians. It's a famous scene. Look at it. Look at the art. It's a famous. It's in many Polish schools. You get what I'm saying? This is about it. Here, no Polish-Ukrainian War. It's all about this area that I'm pointing to over here. This is the current map. They're fighting in Volhynia, which, as you see, overlaps both areas. Okay, and they're fighting down here in what we call Eastern Galicia, or Ruthenian Galicia and all that. So all this was suppressed under the Austrians when Franz Josef was there, and nobody could fight about this. Therefore, it was good. The Jews like that. Franz Josef prevents the Ukrainians from attacking the Poles and vice versa, and it's law and order. That's what the Jews needed more than anything else. But now that's over. And so there was a big famous pogrom, for example. Let's go to the next one. Here in Lvov, there's a Polish picture. So in other words, they're kind of proud of this. It's not a Jewish picture, right? because they went crazy. They said the Jews joined the Ukrainians, started shooting at them. The Jews said we didn't join anything. One of those if and buts. And to this day, the Polish foreign ministry and others would say the Jews started the pogrom in Lvov, and they started shooting us first. And the Jews say no, no, no. And you'll never get at the bottom of that. All I know is the Jews are thinking like this: we're living here hundreds of years. I don't care who's in charge. Just deliver the mail, collect the garbage, right? Sweep the streets and leave me alone. No, how can you say that? It matters more than anything else in the world if this will be part of Ruthenia or be part of Poland. What's the Jew supposed to say? He's supposed to say, it matters to you. You can't do that. And so, hence, you're stuck between the rock and the hard place. And the Poles already then say what all the anti-Semites said: we didn't do it, and you deserved it. Right? And here and there, sporadic pogroms are carried out by Polish military units, the way the Russians had done. The Polish Jews protest. Word gets out to Paris, where the Big Four meeting, Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George and the others. The Big Four say to Paderewski, the famous Polish pianist, remember the classic pianist? He was supposed to be the face of the cultured Poland. The new Poland, they say, is going to be democratic, nice, it's going to be like America. Hey, it's not happening over there. And they say, what's going on? And Paderewski, oh, we didn't do it. And Woodrow Wilson says, really? And so, under pressure, public opinion, American, Jewish opinion, other, Woodrow Wilson appoints what they call the Morgenthau Commission. This is the father of Roosevelt's Morgenthau, the old man, who was anti-Zionist, oh my goodness, and beyond reform. Henry Morgenthau Sr., he was Wilson's ambassador to Turkey. He made a fortune by buying the real estate where the subways were put. Get it? That's the way to do it, okay? That's how he got rich. Somehow or other he figured out, where they're going to do the thing. So he was loaded, and he gave a lot of money to Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic Party, and so on and so forth. And so he was something of a macher, but it was well known that he's very much a WASP Jew, if you follow what I'm saying, tries his best. So he's a safe Jew, and he headed a commission of American military officers and diplomats to go visit Poland. Of course, when he goes to Poland says, oh, we didn't do it. Anyway, the Jews deserve it. They're parasites, they're leeches, they cheat everybody, they look funny, they're dirty, this and the other, but we didn't do anything, And the Poles say, listen, if you attack us, you're only helping Russia. And so basically, the Morgenthau Commission more or less whitewashes what happened. But it was good it was there. At least it reminded the Poles that people are watching. You understand? Meanwhile, Poland's fighting its own battles. They stole Eastern Galicia, to be perfectly honest. The majority of the population was not Polish, but they got away with it. The Allies condemned it. The League of Nations condemned it. And in 1923, they finally said, we recognize this. Poland says, might makes right. Same thing with Posen. Here's Pilsudski taking over the German part in Posen. The Germans say, no, you can't do this. The majority of Germans over here. And they said, we're doing it anyway. It used to be ours anyway. You stole it from us. And you go back to that thing, back and forth. The Jews in Posen now find themselves under a funny situation. They spend the last 150 years Yekieizing because they're under Prussia. They're all Polish Jews like Gretz, and then they had to turn themselves into German. And now, shift gears, right? Drop the German, go back to being Polish. How does one do that after you've been brainwashed for more than a couple decades, over 100 and some years, since 70s, in Prussianism. So the Jews don't count. They're just collateral damage. The population borders, that's what Poland wants. It's not Posen anymore, it's Poznan, you understand? Now, to be perfectly honest, I do understand. Every one of these national claims makes sense if you're a member of that national group. That's the problem with national arguments. If you're Israelis, the Jewish claim makes sense. If you're Palestinian, the Arab claim makes sense. It does. But what are we supposed to do about it, you know what I'm saying? So, you have this terrible situation. For Poland, as I said before, what happens is they grab all this land, but Pilsudski, who meant well, and who was not bad to the Jews at all, he was the most liberal towards the Jews you could find in Poland. Tried to make this case last year or 2 years ago, but he was like Bismarck. He reaps a legacy of hate. And I just didn't feel like finding the movie. The Poles made a big movie I showed pieces of last summer, whenever it was, called Volhynia. And it's a Polish movie, and it's all about the unbelievably horrific massacres that the Ukrainians perpetrated on the Poles during World War II, which had nothing to do with World War II. Just it was a chance for them to get their own things. And it's a movie, of course. We've seen them burning children, tearing people apart with horses, going after everybody with farming implements. Now it's actors, but still, it's sufficiently realistic that the Ukraine is freaking out and all that, and the Poles think you did it. And I've seen other Polish history exhibits where they always call this, because that's their Holocaust, if you follow what I'm saying. It's their little Holocaust. I think 400,000 people were killed, but I could be wrong in the numbers. But all I'm saying is, your American audience, you say, why does this group hate that group? They're all white, they're all European, they all talk funny, together, right? They're all Christian. What's it all about? Oh, because you don't know about the Polish-Ruthenian War of 1919. And the American says, what are you talking about? And life is lived. So you end up with chaotic situations going on all throughout Eastern Europe with different armed groups running around, and Jews are usually defenseless, right? The Jews don't at that time carry weapons, and consequently they're easy prey, and that's what happened. So this guy's uncle was shot by the Poles, and that one by the Ruthenians, and this one was shot by the Lithuanians retreating from the Poles, and this one this and that and the other. And who cares if my bubby got shot? I don't care who did it. You understand? That's the bottom line. That's the bottom line. So it's a terrible set of a situation. That's set of wars number one. Put that over here in your mind. Now I'm going to tell you about set of wars number two that's centered around Ukraine, which is a country that tried to get off the ground but didn't succeed. Here it was Ukrainians trying to establish a state. Ukraine's a big area, much bigger than Poland. But as they're trying to set up a state, they're attacked by the Red Army, by the Poles, and by each other, because the Ukrainian groups couldn't agree on stuff, and therefore they fought and killed each other like crazy. That's where the yeshivas were. There's a huge Jewish population living in the Ukraine. Wrong place to be, wrong time. Right? Wrong place, 1990, wrong time. And so what happens? Basically, you have several wars going on at the same time. You have, for example, the Soviet-Ukrainian War, which is Lenin versus the Ukrainian leader Petlura, Simon Petlura, who is a famous and extremely controversial person who's seen a second. Let's go to the next map. 6 armies are fighting it out. Here's the White Russian army. There's the Red Army. The Lithuanian army is pulling in there. The Polish army. These are local armies that are fighting with each other. Oh my God. And it's not a map with colors. It's real life. That's the wrong place to be, as I keep saying. So what does this mean in real life? If you live in a village or a town. So don't be surprised. Between one group and the other, they start mass shootings and killings of Jews. Okay? So, for example, let's go to the next one. I just got this offline, it's easy. The Kiev pogroms of 1919 referred to a series of anti-Jewish pogroms in various places around Kiev, meaning in Ukraine, carried out by White Volunteer Army troops. That's the anti-communist army. The series of events concern Skvira, a pogrom, 45 Jews massacred, many severely wounded, 35 Jewish women raped. That's Square Town. Skvira is square. Square Rebbe. Right? Square Town. Justingrad, August, made its way through the shtetl, unspecified number of murder and Jewish women raped. Ivankiv, October, Konderet, 14 Jews massacred, 9 wounded, 15 Jewish women and girls raped by units under the command of Strzok in 3 days of carnage. It doesn't stop for 3 days. Because who's going to stop it? You understand? I tell you again, that's what the Pirkei Avos means. A bad government is worse than no government. Because, they just go crazy. And why not? The Jews are there for the picking. The Jewish women are there for the picking. Why the heck not? You understand? That's the mentality of the people and who's going to call them to justice? Nobody will ever do that. You understand? So, I'm not finished. Let's go to the next one. The Kiev pogroms proved to be the first of many such events. There were a total of 1,300 pogroms. 1,300, over 1,300 pogroms across Ukraine at this time, in which between 30,000 and 70,000 were killed or massacred. Really, the numbers are closer to, it's around 100,000, okay? This is very conservative. The pogroms were marked by utmost cruelty and faith-based brutality. Thousands of women raped, hundreds of shtetl pillaged, Jewish neighborhoods left in ruins. Some statistics, in these pogroms, 500,000 left homeless. So you got 100,000 killed, another 100,000 homes are destroyed. And I got news for you. If you're in Eastern Europe and your house is destroyed in this winter, you die. Yeah, it's over. That's all. It's over. Of these, 53% by Petlura's Ukrainian army, then 17% by the White Army. The Red Army did 2%, and local bands. Well, it does matter who did it, but not to the victim, you understand? These estimates, deaths including massacres, include massacre-induced disease, starvation, recent incident on records, judged presented by the White Army be higher, as high as 50%. So let's go to the next one. Bottom line, 100,000 killed, 200,000 orphaned, and 500,000 left destitute. And that's probably a conservative figure, in my opinion. The historians now are arguing over this. Naturally, Ukrainian historians are going to do what? Put the numbers down, right? Jewish historians, the numbers up. Which is the real truth? Up. This is what you're dealing with, okay? So, by the way, this is the years from 1914 to 1924, terrible time for the Jewish woman. Okay, you're talking about millions of rapes. I don't know what the aftermath of this was. They had children, and them children. This, it's just, it's a mind-boggling. You understand? Plus the moral collapse that we spoke about the other time. It's not a happy period to study, but it wasn't that long ago. Okay, the Soviets said they're against anti-Semitism, but the Red Cavalry, as they called the First Cavalry Army, which was a ferocious Soviet unit, right? Very famous. These generals all became Stalin's top general, Varshilov, Budyonny, and all this. They became the top marshals in the Soviet army. They're brutal. And if nobody really cares, they'll do it to Jews or anybody else. How do we notice? One of the most famous writers of the 20th century is Isaac Babel, who was a Jew who converted to communism, shall we say that, from Odessa, and joined the Red Army, and wrote about it and won Nobel Prize or something like that. He didn't win Nobel Prize, he won a big prize, very famous for a number of stories, some about Jews and all this kind of stuff. Very complicated person, eventually shot by Stalin like everybody else, but meanwhile he had a run, and he wrote a very famous book called The Red Cavalry. So he's a Jewish guy with glasses and all this, running with all these Cossacks, the Red Cavalry. And there's part in the book they published, and then he published another book. In the other book, he told the real story, okay? And here, go. That's Isaac Babel. There's his book, Red Cavalry. Right under my window, some Cossacks are trying to shoot an old silver-bearded Jew for spying. Yeah, right. No, an old rabbi in the Ukraine in 1920 is spying for the CIA, right? Okay, let's get this straight. The old man was uttering piercing screams and struggling to get away. Then Kudra, machine gun section, took hold of his head, tucked it under his arm like a chicken. The Jew stopped screaming, straddled his legs, took out his dagger with his right hand, and carefully, without splashing himself, cut the old man's throat. Now, just multiply this thousands of times. Now, the communists would, by the way, Marshal Budyonny, the head of the thing, wanted to kill this writer, Babel. You understand? Because the way you sing Lashon Hara about the Red Army for. Lashon Hara, I would remind you, is true, right? But for various reasons, they didn't shoot him then. They waited about 20 years. Now, what's the point? This is killing for fun. If it's the Russian Civil War, which we're dealing with over here, these crazy years, human life is nothing. And a Jew's life is really nothing, because the others have somebody stand up for them, or the relatives might get, nobody's going to, if they kill a bunch of, this guy did this random thing on the Jew, you tell me, what is going to happen to a soldier in the Red Army like that? Once in a while, I'll be fair about it, once in a while, since Trotsky was in charge, the Red Army took some of these things seriously, and they would shoot a couple of these guys. But I would say they were shot maybe 1 or 2%, and 99% not. So this is how it goes. The American Jewish community was horrified, and they sent a big delegation of the Joint Distribution Committee to go see what's happening over there. And two of the leading Jewish representatives from the United States, Professor Israel Friedlander from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and Rabbi Bernard Cantor, a former rabbi who was active in relief efforts. These are big names, especially him. He was perhaps, after Solomon Schechter, once upon a time, the #1 Jewish intellectual. He wasn't from, but him and Mordechai Kaplan started Young Israel, right? And then Young Israel went off on its own to the right. But very important person. They shot them both. Who shot them? The Red Army. Later on, but if you could say, but I'm going to tell you something, there's studies on this. All the Yiddish newspapers say it wasn't the Red Army, it was the Polacks. You understand? Because the Red Army doesn't do that. It's the Polish that did it. And so the whole thing got smished with the Jewish politics. And the Forward and all these newspapers, it was the right-wingers that did, not the left-wingers. But to be perfectly honest, they all engaged in killing Jews. This is how it went. And by the way, we're not even talking. Zelo ba b'cheshbon. If you're a Jewish lady, for example, you have a wedding ring, you just give it away. If you're talking about stealing and things like that, we don't even have time to think about that. We're talking about, we're serious, but the scale of the chaos and the devastation that hit the Jews in Ukraine in 1918, 1920, 21, and so forth, just unbelievable, right? It's 100,000 were killed. And how many more were attacked than otherwise? Who's at fault? So the Jews all say Petlura, the head of the Ukrainian, government. It's not really true. He tried to get him to stop it, but they didn't listen. But he became the figure, like the Hitler. And the Soviets pushed this, because that way they did all the bad stuff. The Soviets didn't do anything. And in 1927, when the Ukraine had already been crushed, and he lived in Paris, a Jew shot him in a famous public case, Shalom Schwarzbard, very, very famous case, shot him in the street, and he said, I did it because the pogroms that he perpetrated against my family and others, and a French court found him innocent. It's a very famous case. After they had a jury trial, and he had a good lawyer, I forget who. There used to be books on this. In your parents' time, your grandparents' time, were books on this. Maurice Samuel and others, the Schwarzbard case. But to be perfectly honest, it's not really so. And the hardcore Ukrainian nationalists, if you want to really be 100% honest, are kind of conflicted on the Jews, even the weirdos, the same ones that commit murders don't necessarily have Jews. The proof of my pudding is today. In the year 2019, Ukraine is a profoundly anti-Semitic country that just elected a Jewish president. Last week. See what I'm saying? It ain't simple. I always hate simple, right? It's not simple, okay? Now, to get more into this, when the Ukraine was overrun by the Russians and then they made a comeback, so what's going to happen now? The Ukrainians are going to come back again. Jabotinsky, the Zionist leader, cut a deal with Petlura on his own that the Ukrainians would agree that the Jews should form their own separate army, like a gendarmerie, like a police force, to go in towns, wherever the Ukrainians take over, and protect the Jewish population. Makes sense to me. Immediately, the socialist Zionists and the other left-wing groups, like Jabotinsky's a fascist, he's allying himself with the Ukrainian pogromists. It's a little bit like the Trump thing. In other words, you can't say nothing good about the Ukrainians. It was a tremendously tarred and feathered, okay, for even daring to make a deal. And I even saw in Israel, because I looked at this in Haaretz naturally, Shlomo Avi says, Jabotinsky showed his essential fascism when he cut a deal with Petlura in 1920. No, he's trying to save a Jewish life. But many. You understand? Because Jabotinsky was Ukrainian, if you understand, he's born in Odessa, although he's also Russian, just like all the Ukrainians are half and half. And, there you go. In his day, before the First World War, he got $1 a word when he wrote an article in the paper. That's what a good writer was in Russian. He got $1 a word. Okay? So you have a confused situation. And what doesn't help is like this. What about America? Woodrow Wilson got a stroke. There was no government in America. Do you know your American history? What happened? The wife took over. I think we all learned this in high school, right? The wife took over, so there was no government. So ordinarily, that's just an interesting episode in American politics, because they dialed him up and made him look for the cameras and all. But really, he was out of it. I'm talking about the Jewish angle. It was a disaster. They needed him so that the American government might be able to intervene in some of these places. There is no American government. So it was a perfect storm. Meanwhile, the Reds conquered Ukraine. So all this became a bracha l'vatala. All these bands were eventually exterminated, not because they're anti-Semitic, but because they're anti-communist. So of all the mafias, one mafia came and took over the whole area. But then what does that mean? if Russia conquers Ukraine, now they're cheek and cheek up to Poland. So now starts a new war called the Russian-Polish War of 1920-1922. Okay? It's a very famous war, and the Russians invaded Poland, the Red Army, and came close to almost winning. At the last minute, the Poles pulled off a military coup that shocked everybody. They smashed the Russian army. Still today called the Miracle de Vistula. This is Pilsudski's finest hour. And the Poles have movies and movies about, because this is the one war they won, and, well, it's an interesting war. Now, I want to tell you something. Let's go to the next one. Here, the Polish posters fight the Russians because the Jews. This is Trotsky, right? And there's some other posters, but I don't think I could show it here in the show. The lascivious Jews covered with blood coming to, so they're going to line everybody up against the wall. Poles, fight for your lives against the Jewish invasion. Right? So if you're Jewish living in Poland in 1920, it ain't push it. Now, the truth is it's more complicated because the Jews also didn't want to be overrun by the Russians, except the left-wingers who did, because they were in La La Land, they thought it'd be Gan Eden. There was a very big movie made a couple years ago in Poland, all about, it's called Battle of Warsaw. And, it's a rave, it's like their movie, I don't know, Gone with the Wind. And, wait a minute, but it's made by Poland's #1 movie producer. The Cecil B. DeMille of Poland is Jerzy Hoffman, who's Jewish. Now, he's completely assimilated. He's Polish, but he's Jewish. And therefore, in his way, when he made this movie, he tried to give a more nuanced view of what's happening, and he did a good job. So I'll show you a scene, and I'm leaving the sound out to show, but the point. Here, the Red Army comes into a Polish village. They immediately round up everybody in the square. You'll notice a bunch of Jews there because they have them wearing talesim and things like that. See that? For example, actors, obviously. I mean, they're Polish actors with a beard. And so, and here comes the commissar, right? The new commissar, and he said, we're appointing a new city council or something like that, and who wants to volunteer, right? Don't you want to overthrow the Polish landlords and all the rest of the answer? They're the Jews, right? They're the Jews. And don't you want to volunteer to join the new glorious red, government? And nobody does, okay? And so what he's ended up doing is doing like this. He said, okay, we'll do like the army. I'll pick the volunteers. You, T, and T. You, and you. And so nobody wants to say yes. You. Okay? So there's some guy, a regular Pole. They put a badge on him. And here's a chassid, right? And they put a badge on him. You see? And another chassid. Here's my point. When the Polish army comes and retakes that village in the counteroffensive, what's going to happen to all those people that were on the committee? You see my point? Now, is it his fault? What's he supposed to do? Do you honestly think a Ger Chassid is a communist? You get what I'm saying? Doesn't mean anything. So here you at least have an attempt, because Jerzy Hoffman is Jewish, to give a little bit of a reality. I give him credit for what's really happening over there. And then the Russians got up to the 1 yard line, and then the Poles made a surprise attack on the flank and then threw them back to their 1 yard line. That's called the Battle of Warsaw. It is an interesting military feat. And as the Russians come to the outskirts of Warsaw, because that's as far as they got, so the whole population is called out to either go and fight or dig the trenches. And you'll see the Poles are going out to fight. This is true. And the Jews, among other in masses, are digging the trenches, which is also true. So in other words, they helped. You follow? Now again, if I know Poland, the Polish audience will say, well, Jerzy Hoffman, he's a Jew, so he's going to put this in there. But it's actually true. Let's take a look at this. Right? Here the Hasidim all digging the trenches around the city, as the Polish army in the background goes out to fight the Ruskies. All right? So at least he's trying to show there's a heavy Jewish element here, you see? It's like all Hasidim. And there's probably truth to that. So, wait a minute. If you're a Chassid, I thought Warsaw is a safe place. It was occupied earlier by the German army. The worst of it, we were spared. Poland became a country. It wasn't like, God forbid, Ukraine or something like that. Wrong. If you're in the summer of 1920, the Red Army's up to you, and you get bombarded, and maybe somebody got killed or some shul got blown up by some stupid, shell shot by one side or the other in the middle of a gigantic war, right? In the end, the Poles won. They called the miracle of the river, the Vistula River over there. Poland then launched a counterattack, as I said before, and which was very successful. And by the time it's over, the Russians cut their losses, the Soviets, and they made a treaty. They stopped the war with Poland already beyond the Polish line, meaning Poland took over a chelik of Belarus and a chelik of Ukraine. But the Russians said, better just stop the war. Stalin, of course, later on got everything back. Now, what's my point? That means a whole portion of heavily Jewish territory was just now annexed to Poland. There's a positive side and a negative side. From the religious point of view, there's a positive side, because in communism, there's no Jewish religion. On the other side, there is a Jewish religion. What's a border town right near the border? Baranovich, for example, Radin, places like that. You understand? Kletsk used to be Slutsk. Slutsk is over on the Soviet side. So got to right away go to a place called Kletsk. There's a general shifting of the yeshivas and that sort of thing. A few miles over, if you get on the Polish side, not that anybody loves the Poles, but at least in Poland, it's a religious country. You can be a religious Jew, even if you suffer for it. Now for a third set of wars. Lenin versus the Baltic states. There was a thing called the Soviet-Estonian War, I promise you. There's a thing, I'm sure there's no question in my mind, there's a Wikipedia article on it. There really was such things. There's a Soviet-Latvian War, which they made a big movie about in Latvia 2 years ago called Heroes of Riga or something like that. And there's the Soviet-Lithuanian War, okay? So these are three extra wars that are going in there. So I could be living in Shavel or Punovich, all these places. All of a sudden the Red Army shows up. How did this happen? You see? The Soviets actually occupied most of Lithuania. So the poor Jews get it in their air because you have that situation where I just told you, you're now on the city council, and the Litvaks, when they come back, will shoot you. You understand? Poor Jews are everywhere. Lenin conquers Belarus, except the little part that Poland took. So that means that Belarus, including Minsk, for example, is not going to be part of the U.S. My family's from there. Part of the USSR. That's the end of one big Jewish city. Minsk was one of the Iker Mokum Torahs in the world for a couple hundred years. I'll say it again, for a couple of hundred years. Many shuls, schools, yeshivas, scholars, shoftim, very, very, very Jewish town. Not anymore. Starting now, you're under Lenin. It doesn't happen overnight. And there'll be a rather remarkable set of attempts to have underground yeshivas and schools like this in the communist conditions. And you got to give them credit for trying. But the Soviets are the experts in finding out. And they'll get rid of everything, just a question of time. And so the eradication of Yiddishkeit, not of the Jews, the Lenin regime, I'm talking about Lenin himself, who was a terrible person, was in principle opposed to anti-Semitism, provided you define anti-Semitism as a racial thing. In other words, he was 180 degrees opposite of Hitler. Hitler said, if you're Jewish, I don't care what you are, I'm going to kill you. Lenin said, I care what you are. If you're the right kind of Jew, you should be equal totally to everybody else. If you're wrong kind of Jew, well, if you're wrong kind of Christian also. So he would divide it along class lines, economic lines, ideological lines, okay? So this is what happened over here. By the way, it's not only Minsk that is gone, Lubavitch is a Belarusian movement, primarily. And Lubavitch is crushed. The old Rebbe died in Rostov in 1920. So then the Friedrich Rebbe took over, as they call him, Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the two Rebbes ago. And he will try in the 1920s to make a go of it. He's convinced that it's the Jewish communists mucking everything up. If he could get to Lenin and Stalin, they would understand that religious Jews are no threat to the regime whatsoever, and so on and so on. Notice, he regards them, perhaps this was his cultural context, blinders, he regards the communist government as a variation on the Tsarist government. And the Tsarist government is all about being loyal to them. So if you can convince them Lubavitch is loyal, they'll be okay. He didn't understand it's a different fruit. The communism is a different bit. They have no time for any religion whatsoever. And they regard all religion as a big enemy to be destroyed. So Lubavitch is gone. And now what happened to the Lithuanian yeshivas? Well, they were stuck in Ukraine. Oh my God, wrong place to be. There's a very famous story. Rabbi Ruderman, when he was a boy, a young man, when 19 years old, was kidnapped by one of these bands that just running through, I think it was in Kremenchuk or someplace, and they, by the way, they picked him up and took him out. They dragged him by a horse, and they're going to put him up against the wall and shoot him or something like that. And the Rosh Hashiv, Moshe Mordechai Epstein, immediately ran to all these Rich Lubavitch or something like that, put together money, ran and said, here, take the money, let him go. So he was this close. What do they call that in 1919 in Ukraine? Tuesday. Happened all the time. I just told you a story with a happy ending. For every story with a happy ending, there's 100 stories with a non-happy ending. Who did it? Some band. Was it the White Army? Was it the Red Army? No, there are plenty of little groups running around. Because once you have like this, it brings out the worst in human nature. Right? Who are running around all these third world countries? Ideological groups? Yeah. Who else? Bands. They get together. That's what they do. So, caught between a rock and a hard place, the yeshivas were. Only the Red Army can decisively stop the pogroms. Once the communists take over, they're problematic, but at least they stop the violence. When the Red Army came in, they stopped the violence by killing everybody but themselves, But that stops the violence. Say what you want. Once the Reds take over, religion comes impossible. Thanks to the zeal of the Evsexias, what they call the Evreski Sexia, the Jewish section of the Communist Party, and these guys want to be more holy than the Pope. So therefore, they will immediately ferret out, this guy's a shochet, this is a secret shul, and they're having ceremony, secret, davening behind the cemetery and all the rest of it, because they're Jewish from background. So they're the worst of the worst. So wherever the Red Army takes over, they immediately are followed by the Jewish communists or led by the Jewish communists, and they immediately go after very cleverly, anything from. You know who is permanently psychologically scarred by this? The Chavetz Chaim. Okay? He eventually got out, but what he saw Jews do, and communism in general, he's a real believer. And so when he escaped later on to Poland, and he was in his 80s, I guess, he said, this is something unprecedented. It's a government, an ideology, which is attacking God. We've never had that. You've had Christian countries, you had Muslim countries, Protestant, Catholic, Hindu. They all believe in God. They have respect for a higher power. It may not be my version, but respect a higher power. We've never had a principled atheism, which is a militant atheism that's anti-religion. So therefore, this is what he said. Because see, he was in Ukraine in 1918, and he saw the communists running around doing all this stuff. And then, smashing up Sefer Torahs, destroying things, all this business. And so he's scarred. So when he escapes back to Poland, he said, there's really a chov kadosh. The Jews should form an army and fight against Soviet Russia because it's anti-God. Anybody's a loyal servant of the Rebbeinu Shalom has to do things. Of course, he recognized it's impossible, but he's saying this is the right thing to do, okay? And you can only understand it because he lived through the Ukraine in 1918, 1919, and then he saw this stuff that I'm talking about over here. Now, from the point of view of the Red government, of the Lenin's government, this is Lenin, not Stalin, it's very, very interesting to me because the Lenin regime conducted an unbelievably brutal and bloody war against Christianity. You probably don't know this, why would you? But they shot all the priests, they burned down or expropriated all the churches, they took all the gold and silver, they just took all these religious people and shot them in cellars, by the millions. The most beautiful and gigantic churches were blown up. It's all across Russia. I mean, Lenin had it out, like psychologically, against Christianity. And the Christians haven't forgotten this, but he said like this, I'm going to tear it out by the roots, and he did. Okay? He did. By the time he was finished in Stalin, there was just residual memories of the old religious stuff. It wasn't anything real. And if you went to a church, you got in political trouble and all that kind of business. Interestingly, the Lenin regime was more sensitive when it came to Judaism. They were more sensitive to appearing to be anti-Semitic. Okay? It's kind of interesting. And it reveals itself that a number of prominent rabbis in the 1920s were arrested, and each time when there was public outcry, they let them go. They wouldn't let a Christian guy go. They would just shot him. The Lubavitcher Rebbe is a very famous example. I'm sure many have heard that, right? He was arrested by the Soviet regime in the later 20s, and was caused such a big international stink, they just let him go. And then the Lubavitcher made it like a triumphal tour, in America and Europe and Israel. Cheskel Abramsky, if anybody knows that, he was in Siberia. And then, again, there was a big letter writing campaign, this kind of stuff, and just let him go. They exchanged him for communist political prisoners in another country. And same thing with Reb Zevin, who was in jail, and then they let him go. It's kind of interesting, because it wouldn't happen to a Christian religious figure. The contempt for the Christian world, which they viewed with undisguised hatred. I think I can only surmise that Lenin grew up in the pre-revolutionary Russia, in which anti-Semitism was looked at as a reactionary movement, a part of the Tsarist regime, and he didn't want to look too Tsarist. Stalin had less problems with that, but he had some of that. So it's actually very, very interesting in that regard. So Lenin was not as anti-frum as the Avsexias, the Jewish communists, were. I tell you again, they were more Catholic than the Pope. Accordingly, in the summer of 1920, in the middle of all these wars, the yeshivas are given permission by the communist government to depart to Ukraine and go back to Lithuania. Particularly after the middle of 1920, when the Soviet Union made a peace treaty with Lithuania, if you can follow that. So now they have peaceful relations, and they let them go. Almost all, not Navardik, but they let them go. So it's like a miracle, you understand? To get a visa to leave Russia, everybody wanted that, And each yeshiva in its own way, Slobodka gets out in this month, and Radin gets out in this month. They did get trains. The USSR, as I said before, by the end of the year was making peace with the neighbors for its own reasons around there, Lithuania and Poland, all the rest of it. Therefore, you could legally cross the border. Part of the reason, not the whole reason, is American intervention. What American intervention? Woodrow Wilson was out of commission, but Herbert Hoover was not. Herbert Hoover at this time was Mr. Food. He had been appointed by Wilson to be in charge of all the food in America during the First World War. He was the food czar, and Herbert Hoover had a great humanitarian reputation. He saved the Belgians from starving in 1914 and afterwards. Belgians. And he moved miracles of logistics. He was quite a guy. And moved miracles, and and then when he takes over as America's food czar, he's feeding Germany and the Allies and Asia, and he's just running an unbelievable operation. And Lenin is going through a starvation in Soviet Russia, and Lenin hates to appeal to a capitalist like Hoover, but he had no choice. And he tries to set conditions, and Hoover says, "I'll send Americans to do it my way, or we get no food." And so it's just a very interesting episode in which the Soviets just had to let the Americans run all over Russia, otherwise they wouldn't get any food. And Herbert Hoover's personal secretary is Louis Strauss, who later on became a big shot in the American government. And I think Louis Strauss sensitized him to the Jewish situation. And therefore the Russians have to tread somewhat carefully because of this reason. That's my personal opinion. Anyway, the Rosh Yeshivas and all the others, as they leave Russia, are quite aware that they're abandoning their fellow Jews to the communist regime and the destruction of Judaism, first things first. As I told you, Chavetz Chaim will never get over it. He feels like he abandoned the other Jews to atheism, which is true, and to a terrible fate, which from a religious point of view is true. And, it just bothered me. He kept saying, we have to go back and fight. Only two groups that I'm aware of don't want to leave. They want to stand and fight. One is Lubavitch, and the other one is Navardik. Okay? Here is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the new one after the other one died in Rostov, the Friedrich Rebbe, as they call him. There's the altar of Navardik, rare picture. And he's the one who started Navardik, and he's, shall I call it, the Litvische version of Chabad, if I can use that expression, without going into details on this. And one thing is true about both of them, like that, right? Very stark. And it's like, if you want to get rid of Judaism, double, like that. Well, easier said than done. Easier said than done, okay? It doesn't really work. Now, it's very heroic, and I could sit here, maybe one time I will, and tell you stories about what happens in the 1920s, the amazing things that happened with the Chabad and the Navardic trying to withstand the Soviet regime. They're really remarkable stories. But in the long run, then KVD will arrest you. You understand? There's no long-term, you can't go against the communist regime. That's unfortunately the way it goes. Doesn't really work. Or maybe it does. Whatever little Judaism is left in Russia, which is a percent of a percent, is due to Navardic and Lubavitch. Talking in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, all the rest, very tiny, very, very tiny, very low grade. It has to be. But whatever ember is there is left from these groups. You understand? Now, not exactly. One thing I haven't devoted attention to is, and if any of you have a medical background, you'll understand what I mean. The world I'm describing is a public health nightmare. Agree? We have some MDs in the audience. It's the malnutrition, it's the soldiers, it's the venereal disease, it's the stom disease. Plus, what happened do we know in 1919, 1920? You have the influenza. What else is going to rage in these kind of areas? Typhus. These things carry off zillions, including many Jews. So here is not an anti-Semitic per se, but lots and lots of Jews, like the Alter of Navardic. He, and who else were Vitzel Aponovitcher? They were these righteous types. When their students were sick, they said, I'm going to take care of them anyway. Okay, so they caught the typhus and died. That's what happened to them. You understand? Because it was raging. And I'm sure the malnutrition must have played a big role, right? I mean, against the human ability to withstand it. And so I'm throwing everything at you tonight. Considering the enmity of the communist religion in general, and Judaism in particular, not to Jews, but to Judaism, the fact that the Lenin regime allowed the Lithuanian yeshivas to escape in the 1920s is really divine providence. What are the chances of that? Because that's how Orthodox Judaism survived in the 20th century. They could have just shot them all. They would not be noticed among the 100,000. And you wouldn't have much of a Yiddishkeit in the 30s and after the Second World War. I wouldn't be standing here today, most likely. It's interesting that the communist regime would allow them to leave and then flourish in Lithuania and all that is really quite remarkable. The new states of Poland and the Baltic, not great for the Jews. Poland, very problematic, especially for the Galician Jews. They used to be under Franz Josef. Under Franz Josef, the Jews have full civil rights. When they hired for public things like the railroad and all that, it was merit-based appointments. It didn't matter who you are. You could be a chassid, you get a job with the government. Poland takes over, only Poles, only Christians. You understand? Jews have a lot of bars and things. No. Nobody go to a bar unless you have a special license from the government, which is only given to veterans of the Polish Legion. Right? Nobody can have a cigarette store, you and I would call a makolet, unless you get a special license from the government. All these are code words for saying no Jews. So Jews are iced out of entire sectors of the economy without using the words. You understand? So like we say today, no more Jewish clothing stores, no more Jewish shoe stores, no more Jewish this, that, and the other, without using those words. Why? There are too many Jews. Poland will be a country of 30 million with 3.5 million Jews. It's too much. Jabotinsky has a famous essay, what he calls objective anti-Semitism, where he says it's not the Poland's fault. If all the civil service jobs are given on merit basis, who's going to ace the highest test? If all the application for the medical school going on the highest grades, who's going to fill the medical school, the law schools, and all the rest of it? It'll be Jews. And it's not their country. You understand? Liberalism is a great idea when it works for you. Nobody likes liberalism when it works against you. That's why Jabotinsky said the only thing we have to do is get a state of Israel. There's no other solution. Then it'll be a Jewish state. All the doctors can be Jewish. All the post workers can be Jewish. But in Poland, you're going to expect these kinds of reactions. Well, it's an interesting analysis, but the bottom line is that the new post-war Eastern Europe will see tremendous Jewish poverty, all during the 1920s and 30s among large groups, very large, tremendous poverty. The American Jews, if you had relatives in this country in the 20s and 30s and they were nice people, they always sent checks back every month to the old country. Did they do that in South Africa? I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did. You know, everybody took part of it. In fact, I know myself, people, they didn't make a lot of money, but they sent a little bit back over there because the need was tremendous. You understand? The Joint Distribution Committee maintained soup kitchens throughout Eastern Europe, that whole area that I showed you there, down to Hitler's time, because there were plenty of people who didn't have work. And where are you going to get food? And I mean, that's the soup for breakfast, soup for lunch, soup for supper. But it's like that old story, stone soup, you know what I mean? It's what you put in it. And so there was, this is how, when I myself was in Punovich a couple of years ago, in 2017, and there was an Israeli tour guide, happened to hook up with her walking by, and she said, this is the old streets of this is Joint Street. Do you understand? And that's because that's where they had the soup kitchen. Because there were Jews. Well, are you surprised after everything I'm talking about? You see what I'm saying? And the government didn't want to help because the government's like, it's any help we do, we want it for the locals. Why the Jews are interlopers? You see? So what do? What's the future? You can't go to America after 1924, right? They put the Quota Act in, the Johnson Act. So what do? Can't go to Palestine because Chaim Weizmann is in charge and they have the Gucci Aliyah. He says, we don't want those Jews. I want young. No, I want only a certain type. They have to be teenagers, physically healthy, not corrupted by Polish, Yiddish, bourgeois attitudes. Let me tell you something. In 1926 and 27, they had what they called the Grabski Aliyah, in which 20,000 Jews left Poland, went to Palestine, most unusual, and settled mostly in Tel Aviv because of a particularly anti-Semitic Polish Secretary of Treasury and the financial policy they did towards the Jews. And Chaim Weizmann came and made a famous speech, I think it was in 27. He says, I find Tel Aviv disgusting. We don't want to bring the Nevsky Street to Tel Aviv. This is the worst possible thing in the world. Like you would say today, I want to bring the Lower East Side to Israel. The small Jewish peddlers, the shops, he hated it. He was a weirdo in that regard. So the bottom line is there's not going to be a mass aliyah from Poland to Palestine in the 1920s and 30s when they need it. So what do? Okay? Now Jabotinsky famously said, we want everybody, send them now. But he had no power. He had no power. For Orthodox Jewry, and here I come to the end, the war destroyed the inertia that had allowed traditionalism to coast as long as it did. As I told you, in 1914, probably 80% of Russian Jews in Russian Empire were still observant. From ain't the right word, because from means you're like self-conscious, Orthodox. But they were treated as Shomer Shabbos, because that's what the parents did, and that's what they do, and life goes on continually along those lines. That inertia, over. After the war, the new unsettled conditions, plus the moral collapse that I talked about during the war, led to an unprecedented decline in observance and belief. This is when everybody in Lithuania became not from. You see it in the photos, hundreds of photos. There's the old generation, there's the new. There's the old generation, there's the new. Go to the Holocaust Museum or take out your family pictures and just see the war years and after war years. That's when the young generation said, "We're out of here. We don't want this. We're not interested in this." And by the way, they didn't say it in a rough way. These are nice family pictures. They just went their way. They didn't, you don't argue with your Zaidi, but you do your thing, okay? This is just what happened. The Orthodox would try to put up a fight in the 1920s and 30s, more successfully in some places, less successfully in other places. By the time it's over, the only two movements that had any vitality was Hasidic movement in Poland, which suffered from this, but became pretty militant and pretty organized in the 1930s, and the Lithuanian yeshivas, but that's for another series. Time precludes me from doing justice to what happened in Central Europe to the lands of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because that's a whole thing by itself. This used to be Austro-Hungary, especially Hungary and Galicia. We just saw Galicia became part of New Poland, and things went down. And in Hungary, for a bunch of reasons, look, Hungary went from this to that little thing. And the Hungarians freaked out, and Romania took a lot, and Yugoslavia took a lot, and Czechoslovakia took a lot. And Hungary turned also much more more anti-Semitic after the First World War than before. Before the First World War, there was no anti-Semitism in Hungary. And after the First World War, for a number of reasons that I don't have time to go into because it's late. I don't have a sixth lecture over here. I want to make two observations looking back and then conclude. I'm talking about the significance of the First World War on the Orthodox Jewry. On the one hand, the catastrophe overstrained and destroyed most traditionalist frameworks. Particularly hard hit was cultural insularity. Every army in the world is all over the place. The old little bubble is not there. This combined with a new increased anti-Semitism everywhere and with worsening economic conditions that fed the anti-Semitism. Because if the public is hungry and it's a Jew's fault. You see? This was what I would call an anti-Frum set of mega trends that beyond the control of anybody, just the detritus of the war. On the other hand, interestingly, I would argue, the First World War began the process, which was completed in the Second World War, of exposing the hollowness of Western culture to the religious Jews. Western culture, by the time we finished the Second World War, it used to look like this, like Daniel's statue, and then look like this. Because if you can have a Hitler, if you can have a Stalin, you can have all the other junk that's going along there, right? And the virulent racism that I just described over there. So what's the Western culture? Because the Germans have Beethoven. That makes them a cult. That's how you define a culture, you see? Now, is this an accurate portrayal of Western culture? That precisely the debate within Orthodox Jewry for the last 100 years, certainly since the Second World War, since the First World War, okay? It's riven down to today with two schools of thought. One says, Western culture is pretty good, except those parts that we can't take. So we should adopt as much of Western culture as we can, except those parts which obviously we can't accept. And the other view goes, the right-wing view, Western culture is basically bad. Therefore, we shouldn't have any of it, except the parts that we cannot afford to ignore. We have to have technology. You understand? You got to have a phone, right? These controversy rage today in the Orthodox world. In this controversy aspect, the legacy of the First World War is still alive in Orthodox Jewish culture. And we are done. Adjourned for Sinai. Good night.